This book sucker punched me, fundamental to my taste, to my channel. I was just sobbing and I loved it so much.
This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence.
Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I decided that I was going to share with you every 5-star book I've ever read. Now that's a bit of an ambitious plan. Every book I've read which I've rated 5 stars, which I can remember having done so. I'm going to be breezing through each book quite quickly because obviously there's over 80 books here, and if I spend like 5 minutes talking about each book, we're literally going to be here all day, beginning from when I was my youngest until now. Here's every book I've ever loved enough to give 5 stars. The very first book / book series I want to talk about is Harry Potter. Boy wizard goes to wizard school. Very famous story. Basically, I learned to read off of them. These books were my entire childhood. This is obviously the first book I've given 5 stars. Second one is the Lemony Sneeries? A series of Lemony Snickets, a series of unfortunate events. There are 13 books in this series and I have very strong memories of carting each book home from the library and then rereading it. The 13th book, I remember reading the ending and it was a earth-shattering moment for me as a child. I think I was like 12. Loved them to bits. I still love them now. I want to reread them. Charmed Life by Diana Wynne Jones. I reread this recently. It still stands up. I love Diana Wynne Jones. She's the author of Housewarming Castle. I read this at like 12 or 13, I think, and it is about a young boy named Cat and his sister Gwendolyn, and they go to live in this house with this magician named Christomancy. He's very flamboyant and wizardy, and it's a great story and I love it to bits. Basically every book by Jacqueline Wilson, specifically the illustrated Mum, Midnight, Double Act. I have such strong memories of reading through the whole Jacqueline Wilson shelf in my library in primary school. I loved her books. I read them and reread them and I thought they were absolutely brilliant. Moving along into high school, and this is kind of like the latter stage of high school, the first book I want to talk about is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a book I still talk about to death now. I read this in my last year of high school. Really difficult to define, many different genres. I recommend it to death. It broke my heart. It broke my heart so much. I remember being like 16, 17 reading this and just sobbing. I loved it. The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky, which I reread recently for a reading vlog. It's such a brilliant YA. It's an epistolary novel, so it's written in letters, and it really just encapsulates the vibe of things that I loved when I was in high school. Like, there's so many mentions to the Smiths in this, and I love this so much. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Basically in year 12 we got given the option to do a comparative essay and I chose to compare this to The Taming of the Shrew. I read The Bell Jar and I loved it. It was so sad and so intricate and beautiful. There's a metaphor about a fig tree in here and about life's many winding paths, which I still come back to all the time. I love Sylvia Plath. I love The Bell Jar. Brilliant 5-star A+ book. We're moving on into 2014. This was my first year of university. I don't think I read anything, or I did read. I've read the books I was required to read for uni, but also 2014 was the worst year of my life, and so it was, I don't remember very much of it, but I do remember reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This was in my intro to English class. There's lots of stream of consciousness here. The whole book is set in one day. There's no chapters. Structurally, it's very interesting. You have to read it really slowly to appreciate it. It is a very tricky read, but I loved it to bits. It was my favorite thing I read in Intro to English. Moving along into 2015, and this is the very first year of me doing BookTube, and so this is the first recorded year of my reading. The 3 books I want to mention are Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, The Magic Toy Shop by Angela Carter, and also Anthology of Classical Myth Primary Sources in Translation. So I read all of these for university, these 2 for my Gothic class, this one for my mythology class. I loved these to bits. I feel like they're so fundamental to my taste, to my channel. If you've been here a while, you know these books and I love them to bits. The Magic Toy Shop is a Gothic coming of age story about a young girl named Melanie who has to go live in a creepy toy shop. Frankenstein is, you know, obvious. It's about a monster who doesn't have a name, who was made by a man named Dr. Victor Frankenstein, and then this is just basically all of the really well-known Greek myths in translation. So there's Ovid, there's Hesiod, there's Plato. You got all of the famous ones in here. It's just a great source. Moving on to 2016. This is the very last year of my undergrad. I have All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This is a World War II book. It's told from 2 different perspectives. It is so beautifully written. It's the most beautifully written historical novel I've ever read. I love it to bits. It's about to become a TV show, so I really want to reread it before the TV show comes out. To The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which is a Kunstleroman, not to be confused with a Bildungsroman. This is the artist coming of age story. There's a section in the middle of this book where time is the narrator and there's no focalizers that are human. I love this book, it's brilliant. Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. This is the first book review I did on this channel that actually like got kind of popular. This is a story about a man who's looking back on his youth and his time at university. It's quite sad and forlorn and it's very beautifully written. It's a 5-star book, although I do have some critiques for some things, some certain scenes in this book. Finally, for 2016, I also have On Writing by Stephen King, which I borrowed from the library. This is of course King's memoir on writing and his journey. I thought it was a brilliant memoir. Moving along to 2017, this is the year that I moved to Japan and it's the year I started my postgrad, and I read Orlando by Virginia Woolf, which is about a person who lives for over 500 years, who changes gender. It was really ahead of its time. It's beautifully written. A Room of One's Own, also by Virginia Woolf, which is Woolf's meditation on writing and what it is to be a woman who is writing. It's obviously written in the early 20th century, and so there are some limitations to her examination of this topic, but I love the way it's written, and again, very ahead of its time. The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. I read this on ebook while we were living in Japan. I couldn't really buy very many books at all, A, because we didn't have money, and B, because we did not have the space to bring them home. I remember this book being pitched as a literary fantasy. It's a pre-medieval story, think of like the time of King Arthur, and it is a beautiful book. I really want to reread it. It's about this couple who go looking for their son. Just stunning writing, and I love Kazuo Ishiguro. Another Gothic classic. I also read Jane Eyre this year. I read the ebook, although I ended up buying the physical copy later on. A very well-known, very famous Gothic story about a governess who goes to live in this house with a man who has a child he wants her to look after, and creepy stuff happens, but it's also very funny and very beautifully written, and I love this book. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. I also read this as an ebook and picked up a physical copy later. This is the most traumatized I've ever been by a book, but I love it. It is so sprawling and beautiful and atmospheric, although I will always give so many content warnings for this book, and also a bunch of Haruki Murakami's other work as well. I also read the first A Song of Ice and Fire book, which is of course a Game of Thrones. I didn't start watching the TV show until 2017. I was very late to the game, but I started watching it when we moved to Japan and I loved it to bits, and so I wanted to check out the book as well. Loved the book, thought the characterization was really good. I really want to read the rest of the books, but I'm doing that thing where like I want to wait until I know the last books are coming out because I'm so sick of picking up series and then them not having endings. Loved it, thought it was great. We'll read the rest of them when I know The Winds of Winter is coming out.
Hello, before we move on to the next books on this list, I wanted to thank the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you're looking for a website builder which is easy to use, affordable, and has loads of dynamic and interesting templates to choose from, then Squarespace is for you. Squarespace is the platform that I use to make my own website, and I love it to absolute bits. It was incredibly quick to set up and to get looking exactly how I wanted. Squarespace has loads of benefits, from Fluid Engine, which is its next generation website design system, to its powerful blogging tools and in-depth analytics. Squarespace makes it easy to show off the things that you make and connect with the people visiting your site. If you're looking to make a website, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/ChristyAnnJones to save 10% off your purchase of a website or domain.
Moving on to 2018, we're still living in Japan at this time. Picture of Dorian Gray, which is such an influential book to me. I love this book to bits. I reread it every year. It's tabbed. It's a story about a young man who wants to be beautiful forever, ends up having his beauty captured in a painting. The painting is cursed to essentially become uglier as he does ugly things while he stays beautiful forever. It is such a beautifully written novel. I love it so much. So creepy, so engaging and thrilling. There are some really thrilling bits in here. The Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature, edited by Edward James and Farah Mendelssohn. It's such a good book if you're interested in fantasy lit, if you want a more academic view of that genre. However, in terms of academic writing, it's not that dense. It's reasonably easy to read, and I also generally recommend all of the Cambridge Companion books. I think they're brilliant. Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This is a book that I read suspiciously late because I've loved the Ghibli movie ever since I was 14, have obsessed over that movie for a very long time, but did not get the book until I was living in Japan. The book and the movie are very, very different. I love them both for different reasons. So Housewarming Castle, finally read it in 2018, the strongest 5 stars I can give. And then towards the end of 2018, we moved home to Australia, and I was not in a joyful place. I was desperately trying to find a full-time job in marketing, and it was like a really sad and stressy time. I didn't want to be back in Australia, doesn't matter. Went to the library a lot though. Libraries are constant saving grace in my life. And I read The Invention of Angela Carter by Edmund Gordon. This is a biography on the life of Angela Carter. I remember crying so much at the end because Angela Carter she died really young. She died in her 50s from lung cancer or emphysema, I believe. And it's just a brilliant biography on the life of Angela Carter. And I also borrowed from the library The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart by Holly Ringland, my favorite book set in Australia. I love Holly's writing. It's so bucolic. It captures the Australian landscape really well. And again, cried a lot reading this book. It was not a fun time when I read these 2 books, but it was really cathartic for me to read these, and they stand out really strongly in my memory. Moving now to 2019, and this is the first year where I really properly became a booktuber, where I really read a lot of books. I think this is the first year I ever went over reading 40 books in a year, and so all of a sudden we now have a bunch more 5-star books per year. I have very vague memories of this book, but I know I gave it 5 stars. Everything Under by Daisy Johnson. This is an Oedipus retelling set in the modern time, and it is beautifully written. I remember a lot of really pretty water imagery. I also read Instructions by Neil Gaiman during this time. I listened to this. This is a picture book. It is my favorite picture book. It's my favorite piece of writing by Neil Gaiman. I love the audio of him reading it, and it's basically the instructions for growing up, and it's written in a very fantastical and poetic way, and I love it to bits. I re-listen to it every few months. Like, it's something about that story just feels like going home to me. And the first time I read it, I was like, 2019, I was what, 22? 22 or 23 when I read it. Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. So I'm going to include this and also the 2 books that follow this first book. I think this was when I just discovered Libby and listening to audiobooks from the library. I loved these. I did not expect to fall in love with Anne of Green Gables and this series, but they're so beautifully written. The natural imagery is really beautiful. I love the characterization in these books. It is a story about a young girl named Anne who is an orphan who goes to live on a farm called Green Gables, and I recommend it to death. Definitely pick it up and check it out. Oh yay, The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. This is such a nostalgic one. I read this while I was recovering from my tonsil surgery. I got my tonsils out in 2019, and I read this in a vlog, and I love this book. It is about a young boy named Bod who is raised by ghosts in a graveyard. I cry every time I finish reading this book. It's so beautiful. All of Neil Gaiman's children's fiction is my favorite thing in the world. Really, really, really strong 5 stars to The Graveyard Book. Oh, and every time I forget to mention, I met him, he signed my book, he drew a little gravestone, and he was so lovely because I was very, very earnest in front of him and panicked when I met him, and I was so excited to tell him that he was my favorite author. Anyway, he was really nice to me and I really appreciated it. And also I want to mention Coraline by him, which I also read in 2019 for the first time. I now reread this book like twice a year. We're about to read it for our book club over on Patreon for the spookiest month of the year. The next one is by Stephen Fry, and it is Mythos. I'm also going to chuck Heroes in here as well. I think these are really good, accessible retellings of the Greek myths. If you've never heard the original myths before, I definitely recommend starting with these books because they're really well written, they're really engaging. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, such a strong novel. Of course, it is a dystopian, gentle sci-fi novel about a young woman who goes to live with this family in a context in which she does not have a lot of autonomy over her life and her body. She is a handmaid, and handmaids are forced to bear children. I thought it was so harrowing, brilliantly written, and I really, really loved it. Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. This is one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time. Picks out the most interesting facets of human history. I feel like it really broadened my understanding of humanity and how we have certain systems and why things work in certain ways. I just think it was a really engagingly written book, and I loved it to bits. The Forest of Wool and Steel by Natsume Yashida. This is a beautiful story where basically nothing happens. It is set in Hokkaido in northern Japan during the wintertime, and it is about a man who wants to become a piano tuner owner, and it's about the people in the town and his relationships with those people. It is such a soft and gentle novel. Again, nothing really happens in it, and it's just an absolute delight. And then finally for 2019, we have The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This really was the year of discovery for me with Neil Gaiman's works. This is an adult novel by him. It's quite short, and it's about a man who goes back to his hometown and he starts remembering things that happened to him when he was 7 years old. Much, much darker than his children's fiction. Obviously, this is my favorite adult novel by Neil Gaiman. Moving on to 2020, the year that everything changed. Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. I think originally I gave this 4.5 stars, but now it's a 5-star book for me. I think the world building is so brilliant here. We have 4 POV characters. It's a really expansive, interesting world. I love the way that this book juxtaposes the different mythologies around dragons, how in Western tradition dragons are associated with fire, but in Eastern they're associated with water. This is such a brilliantly written epic fantasy story. Educated by Tara Westover. This is an autobiography about Tara's life, the really extreme and abusive Mormon family that raised her, how she got out of this family, how she clawed for herself an education despite never having gone to primary school or high school. Cried my eyes out reading this book, thought it was amazing. Nights at the Circus by Angela Carter. Somehow I don't have a copy of this, which really confused me because I just spent ages looking for it. This is a story about a young woman whose name is Feathers. She is born with wings coming out of her back. She grows up and she becomes an aerialist. She kind of runs away with the circus. It's a really interesting winding novel, so beautifully told, and because it's Angela Carter, decadently written, and it's a very strong 5 stars. Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I loved the writing in this book. I loved the many different perspectives. I loved the way it explored gender. I thought this book was brilliant in so many different ways. Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I listened to the dramatization version of this. Brilliantly, brilliantly written. Is essentially what it says on the tin. It's a retelling of the Norse myths. Where is it? Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. I have never been sucker punched by a book as much as this book sucker punched me. Oh my god, I love it to bits. It's a very concrete style. I would say it's kind of the opposite to All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, but it is beautifully, beautifully written. This story follows the life of Sunja. It's set in the early 1900s. She's about 16 years old and she gets pregnant to a man who does not want to marry her. She ends up marrying another guy and they go to live in Japan during a time when it was very hostile for Korean people to live in Japan because the Japanese occupation of Korea was still going on. It's set over the course of many years. I love the way that technology evolves in this book. I love the writing. I love the characters. There's one scene in this book that still sits with me and I think about it every now and then, and it's been years since I read the book. It's so good. The Traveling Cat Chronicles by Hiro Arikawa. I remember sitting at my desk working in marketing and eating my lunch and just having tears streaming down my face as I was like listening to this book, and I had to stop because I was like worried that someone would come and ask me a question while I was just sobbing. Told from the perspective of the cat about a man who's going on a road trip across Japan. The natural imagery is absolutely stunning. Ghost Empire by Richard Feidler. This is my favorite history book. This is essentially the history of Constantinople, the city we now know as Istanbul in Tōkyō. However, Richard Feidler in this book, as he's retelling the history of Constantinople, he also explores a trip that he and his son took in 2016 to Istanbul and compares the modern city now to the ancient city. I love the way it was written. It's really engaging. I've reread this book since. I've annotated it. I love this. His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. I want to include all 3 books in this. I am so upset I did not read this earlier. I love the world building here. I think the writing is absolutely amazing. I love the characterization. I love that the second and third books in this series are really different to the first book. I didn't expect the way the story went. We're now moving on to 2021, and the first book I want to talk about is The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I think this is the first book I read in 2021. Such a beautiful, cozy novel. I really loved the vulnerability of the main character, Linus. He felt like such a real, honest character. Oh my god, there's so many things about this story that I loved. It's very whimsical. It feels like a Pixar movie in a book. The next 3 books I want to talk about are the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. I loved these books. I thought the world building was so cool and so strong. I loved the characters. I loved the twists and turns here. I thought this was a really interesting blend of both fantasy and sci-fi elements. The main character, whose name is Esun, her young son has been killed and she's gone off on a journey to find her daughter, despite the fact that this enormous natural disaster has happened and the world is essentially ending, but she doesn't care. She's going to go find her daughter. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which I've been calling Piranesi this whole time and I'm trying to get out of the habit. This is a story about a man who lives in a house that contains the ocean. This book was so interesting, so creative. It's an epistolary novel, so it's told in journal entries. And this one, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is Ocean Vuong's first novel. Now, Ocean Vuong is a very talented poet. This particular book doesn't have a very strong plot to it, but it is beautifully written. I loved the imagery here. I remember sitting in the library at like 8 o'clock at night reading this book and seeing this metaphor about an eye and getting really teary. It was like 10 pages in and it was so beautifully written. I loved this book so much. The Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Tsujimura. I love this story. It's translated from Japanese. It's set in Tokyo. It is about a young girl in high school who stops going to school, and one day when she's at home, the mirror in her bedroom starts shining and this wolf girl pops up and drags her into this world behind the mirror. I loved the themes in this book. I loved the writing. I loved the whimsy of it, the references to fairy tales. I thought this was a brilliant YA in translation. Second Susanna Clarke book of that particular year, and this is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I love this story. This is a Regency pastiche. It's set in the time of like Pride and Prejudice. It's about these two magicians who want to bring magic back to England. I love the academics of this. I love the footnotes. I love the world. I love so many bits I love in this book. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I swear I read this earlier than 2021. I'm pretty sure I did. I just don't have it on any of my lists or notes. Anyway, I read The Hobbit, which is a very famous story. I love this book. I think it's so brilliantly written. It's so much fun. It's so engaging. Of course, it is about a hobbit whose name is Bilbo, who goes on an adventure away from the Shire. What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry. This is a brilliant book about trauma, specifically childhood trauma, and the way that trauma affects the developing brain, the way that trauma and stress affect us now. I think this is a amazingly written book. It's very engaging, it's very informative, it uses a lot of examples and studies. It is obviously quite a heavy book and it does use real world examples of abuse, so if that's a really difficult topic for you, I would recommend reading this book when you're in a really good headspace. But such a brilliant book on trauma and the effects of child abuse, specifically on young people but also adults as well. The Oxford Illustrated History of Witchcraft and Magic. I just wanted to read a non-fiction book about witches. This was the best one I could find online. It's essentially just a history on witchcraft and it's a brilliant one, so well written, really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. Starting Point by Hayao Miyazaki. This is a compilation of Miyazaki's essays. I like this book better than the second book, which is Turning Point. House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. This is a gothic YA which I really loved. It's very creepy. It's perfect for the spooky season. It's about a young girl whose sister goes missing. A lot of creepy stuff happens. There's this mystery from when they were kids. Loved this book. It was so brilliantly done. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. How this book ripped my heart to shreds. Also, the whole way through this book, I think I called the narrator, whose name is Patroclus, I called him Patrollicus because for some reason my brain just likes to jumble letters in the middle of words. But anyway, I love this story, cried a lot, love this book, love the way it was written. Such a strong, brilliant retelling of the myth of Achilles. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. There are passages in this that I just go back and reread now. If you don't know the premise of the book, essentially this is a story about a young man whose name is Richard Papin. He is a university student. He stumbles onto this little group of students who are in this very elite Greek class, and he joins this class and he becomes assimilated into their world of really romanticized academia. I love this book. I think it's so brilliantly written. I think Donna Tartt is such a talent. The next three books I'm including on the 5-star list is the whole Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. The pacing wasn't perfectly to my taste, but I loved this story. I thought it was so expansive and interesting. There's so much here. This book heralded in modern fantasy as we know it, and I loved the process of reading these three novels. The Stationary Shot of Tehran by Marjan Kamali. This is a really interesting historical novel about a young woman whose name is Roya. I learned a lot about Tehran in the 1950s and onwards. I think this was a really engagingly written story and I really enjoyed it. Moving along to 2022, the first book I want to talk about is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is a really famous magical magical realism story out of Latin America. It is about this family in a rural town in Colombia, and it follows them over the course of 100 years. It is the sprawling story. There's a lot of gentle magic in here. I loved the themes of this story. There's so much to love in this book, and I just thought it was brilliant. Julia and the Shark by Kieran Millward Hargrave. This is a middle grade story. The illustrations in here are absolutely beautiful. There's a lot of emotional depth in this story, which I can't really talk about, which is a spoiler, but that's my favorite part of this book. It's about a young girl whose name is Julia. Her mum is a marine biologist. They're on this journey to the north of the UK to look for this Greenland shark. I am also going to mention here Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. The first time I read it, I only gave it 4 stars, but I reread it last year and I gave it 5 stars and I changed my mind. I think this book stands up a lot more on its second read through because I liked it a lot more the second time round. This is about a man whose name is Richard who bumps into a girl whose name is Dor. He gets dragged down into London below, which is where people fall through the cracks, and essentially he loses his life as he knows it and he's fighting to get his old life back. I think the way that this story explored London as a travelogue was really cool, and again it really grew on me the second time round. This one, which I almost forgot, is a graphic novel and it's called Onabi, Diary of a Yokai Ghost Hunter, and it's written by this couple who traveled to Japan. They're from France. It's kind of like a travel memoir, but it also features stories from the locals in the towns that they visited about the ghosts and the yokai. Yokai means spirit in Japanese, or it kind of means like otherworldly thing. I think this is a beautifully illustrated graphic novel and I just loved reading it so much. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This was a really hyped TikTok book that I picked up because it was hyped and I loved it so much. It was a really strong 5 stars. I loved Evelyn's characterization. I loved the story here. I loved the emotional punches of it. She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. I actually met Shelley at AusAsia Festival and I got them to sign this book for me, talk to them about fantasy and being an Australian, trying to get an agent who's interested in fantasy and how tough that is. But anyway, I really loved this book. This was such a brilliant, historically inspired fantasy novel. Essentially, this book is pitched as The Song of Achilles meets Mulan. It's about a young woman whose name is Zhu. Her brother dies. She wants to take his fate from him. She ends up pretending to be a boy and going on to become a monk. There's some really beautiful imagery in here. I love the way that gender was explored. A really wonderful epic story, and the world building is great. I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This is an autobiography / memoir from Jeanette, exploring her childhood and the relationship she had with her mother. Her mother was very abusive and controlling of her. Jeanette McCurdy was of course on the TV show iCarly, and so it looks at child stardom and the pressures that were put on her, and also her experiences with disordered eating as well. But I loved this book. I loved her honesty. Fable by R.F. Kuang, kind of in the same way as Lord of the Rings. There were a couple things that weren't perfectly to my taste, but they were so small that the book still ends up in the 5-star category, and it's the same with this book. I thought the world building here was spectacular. I loved the writing of it. I thought the voice was really strong. I loved the magic system here. The conceit for this one is, I think, a setting response to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and a tonal response to The Secret History, and those are 2 of my favorite books, so this book is very in line with my taste. I really enjoyed it. The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. There's something so nostalgic and comforting to me about John Green reading stuff. I still watch Vlogbrothers. I've been reading John Green's work since I was a literal child, and I love The Anthropocene Reviewed. I think that he is such a talented writer. I love the way that he explores all 50 of the essays in this book. Moving on to 2023, I have only had 3 5-star books so far this year. The first one I read this year that I gave 5 stars to is Jen Campbell's new poetry collection, and that is Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit. I've spoken about this so much so far this year because it's the book I've loved the most. It is an absolutely stunning poetry collection that explores the circus, folklore, the sea. It also explores Jen's own experiences with disability, being in hospitals when she was a kid, IVF. There's so much rawness and honesty here, and I love the way that she weaves through all of that with these beautiful motifs, these really beautiful images. There were a few poems in here that I cried. I loved reading this. Wise Children by Angela Carter. I'm slowly getting through all of Angela Carter's books. This story is about 2 twins who are now in their late 80s, I believe, who are looking back on their life as performers, basically goes through their whole life and the experiences that they had. Because it's Angela Carter, it is of course a wonderfully decadent book, so beautifully written, and I really loved it. And then the final book I want to talk about for this video is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I finished this 2 days ago, and I'm so glad I read this book because I loved it to bits. It was brilliant. It was confronting confronting. There was imagery in here that made me feel so extremely unsettled. It was a really gothic novel. Of course, you guys know I love gothic novels. It is a story about a young woman whose name is Noemi. Try and find out what's going on with her cousin Catalina, who's married this kind of mysterious man who now lives in this creepy gothic mansion in kind of rural Mexico. I love the allegory in this story. I love the way it looked at eugenics. I thought it was really interesting. And there was so much to love about this book, and I thought it was brilliant, and it's the perfect book to read for the spooky season. I know I've forgotten books. I know there are books on here that I just slipped my mind. I'm gonna pretend that I don't know that. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got some good book recommendations out of it. And also I wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon. Over on Patreon we have a whole bunch of lovely bonus content, bonus videos, our book club, our Discord server. We have the Wyvern tier where I make bespoke videos. So for example, I just uploaded a video all about editing and my editing process for Project Teacup. There's a whole bunch of stuff over there. So if you want more content from me, or if you want to support my channel, please feel free to check out Patreon. Take care everyone, and I will see you later. Bye bye.